The naked emperor prances through the marble halls of the Palatine Hill, his body smeared with the blood of freshly sacrificed bulls, wearing nothing but golden jewelry and a crown made of peacock feathers. Behind him, a parade of equally naked Syrian priests chant in tongues, while Roman senators, grown men who once commanded legions, are forced to crawl on their hands and knees, barking like dogs for the amusement of their 14-year-old ruler. This is Rome in 220 AD, the eternal city, master of the known world, conqueror of Gaul and Britain and Egypt, now reduced to a stage for the most spectacular freak show in human history. And at the center of it all, painted like a whore and giggling like a madman, is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, though he prefers to be called Elagabalus, after the Syrian sun god whose holy prostitute he claims to be. He's been emperor for exactly 18 months, and in that time he's managed to scandalize, horrify, and disgust an empire that thought it had seen everything. Romans who watched gladiators tear each other apart for entertainment are now fainting at dinner parties. Citizens who cheered as Christians were fed to lions are now crossing themselves and praying to any god who will listen. Because Elagabalus isn't just breaking laws, he's shattering the very concept of human decency like a sledgehammer through stained glass. And the truly terrifying part, he's just getting started. But to understand how a teenage Syrian priest ended up as the most powerful person on earth, turning the Roman Empire into his personal brothel, you need to understand that this whole mess started with the kind of family drama that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Your story begins not in Rome but in the dusty hills of Syria, in a city called Emesa, where the sun burns like divine fury, and the locals worship a giant black stone that supposedly fell from heaven. It's 24 AD, and the Roman Empire is having what historians politely call political difficulties, and what anyone with sense would call a complete bloody nightmare. The Emperor Septimius Severus is busy trying to keep the empire from falling apart, which leaves plenty of room for ambitious women to scheme. And oh, are there ambitious women in this story? The kind of women who'd make Lady Macbeth look like a kindergarten teacher. Enter Julia Domna, the Syrian empress, a woman with intelligence that could cut glass and morals that were apparently optional. Her sister Julia Maesa is equally brilliant and twice as ruthless, and Julia Maesa's daughters, Julia Soaemias and Julia Mamahea, let's just say that maternal instinct, in their case, was less about nurturing and more about putting their sons on the throne by any means necessary. Into this viper's nest of imperial women is born a baby boy in Emesa. His real name is Varius Avitus Bassianus, but that's far too Roman and boring for what he's destined to become. His mother Julia Soaemias takes one look at her beautiful, strange little boy and immediately starts planning his rise to power, not because she loves him, love is for peasants, but because he's her ticket to ultimate authority. The boy grows up in the shadow of the great temple of Elagabalus, the Syrian sun god, represented by that mysterious black meteorite. While other children play with toys, little Varius is learning the sacred dances, the ritual chants, the holy ceremonies that transform ordinary priests into living conduits of divine power. And there's something about this kid that's different, something that makes grown men uncomfortable and women whisper behind their veils. He's beautiful for one thing, not handsome in the rough Roman way, but beautiful like a piece of art, with features so delicate they're almost feminine. He moves like a dancer, speaks in a voice like honey, and has eyes that seem to see things other people can't. The priests of Elagabalus declare him a prodigy, a chosen vessel of the god. His mother declares him the future emperor of Rome. The Romans, meanwhile, have no idea what's coming. In 211 AD, when our future scandal emperor is 7 years old, Emperor Septimius Severus dies, leaving the throne to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta. What follows is exactly what you'd expect when you give supreme power to two brothers who hate each other more than poison. Civil war, murder, and enough family drama to fuel a dozen soap operas. Caracalla solves the problem of joint rule by murdering his brother Geta, not in private, mind you, but dramatically in their mother's arms, because subtlety was never really a Roman strong suit. He then spends the next 6 years being exactly the kind of emperor you'd expect from someone who starts his reign with fratricide, paranoid, violent, and steadily losing his grip on reality. But Caracalla makes one crucial mistake. He pisses off the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers whose job it is to protect the emperor and who have a long, proud tradition of murdering any emperor who becomes inconvenient. In 217 AD, while campaigning in Syria, Caracalla is stabbed to death by his own guards. Justice, perhaps, but it leaves the empire with a power vacuum and Julia Maesa with an opportunity. The new emperor is a man named Macrinus, a competent administrator with all the charisma of wet cardboard. He's practical, boring, and thoroughly Roman, which means he has absolutely no idea how to deal with the Syrian women who are about to destroy him. Julia Maesa, remember, is the sister of a former empress and the mother of 2 daughters who've been raised to believe that power is their birthright. She's also been quietly building a network of allies, bribing officials, and spreading the word that her grandson, that beautiful strange boy dancing in the temple of Elagabalus, is actually the illegitimate son of the murdered Caracalla. Is this true? Almost certainly not, but truth is for historians, and Julia Maesa is playing politics. She claims that her grandson is the rightful heir to the throne, the lost son of the Severan dynasty, destined to restore glory to Rome. More importantly, she backs up this claim with Syrian gold, Roman bribes, and the kind of propaganda campaign that would make modern spin doctors weep with envy. The boy himself, now 13 and serving as high priest of Elagabalus, probably has very little understanding of what's being planned in his name. He's more interested in sacred rituals, divine ecstasies, and the growing awareness that his body and desires don't quite match what everyone expects from a future emperor. But Julia Maesa isn't asking for his opinion. She's making him an offer he can't refuse. Become emperor, or watch the family fortune disappear, and probably get murdered by whoever does take power. In 2018 AD, Julia Maesa makes her move. She smuggles her grandson out of the temple, presents him to the Syrian legions as the true heir of Caracalla, and promises them donatives, cash bonuses, that Macrinus can't match. The soldiers, being practical men who prefer coin to principles, declare for the boy emperor. What follows is less a civil war than a farce. Macrinus, faced with a teenage challenger backed by Syrian gold and Roman steel, completely falls apart. His army defects, his allies abandon him, and within months he's dead, and the boy from Emesa is marching on Rome. The Roman Senate, faced with the choice between a dead emperor and a living one, makes the sensible decision and declares the 13-year-old Varius Avitus Bassianus to be Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, linking him to the great emperors of the past. They probably think they're getting another boy emperor they can control, like the manageable puppet rulers of the past. They have no idea they've just handed supreme power to someone who's about to redefine the very concept of imperial excess. The journey from Syria to Rome takes months, and during that long march across the empire, something shifts in the boy who's about to become emperor. Maybe it's the intoxication of power. Maybe it's the realization that he can literally do whatever he wants and no one can stop him. Or maybe it's just the teenage rebellion of someone who's been told his whole life that he's divine and is finally in a position to prove it. By the time the imperial party reaches the outskirts of Rome in 2119 AD, the boy emperor has already started making changes that leave his advisors speechless. He's insisted on bringing the sacred black stone of Elagabalus with him, along with a full retinue of Syrian priests. He's commissioned artists to paint his portraits in full religious regalia, including makeup and feminine clothing, and he's made it clear that while Rome may have a new emperor, that emperor has no intention of becoming Roman. The Romans gathering along the roads to catch their first glimpse of their new ruler probably expect a standard imperial procession, eagles, legions, maybe a dignified young man in a toga waving from a chariot. What they get instead is something out of their wildest nightmares. The procession is led not by Roman standards but by Syrian priests dancing and chanting in a language most Romans have never heard. Behind them comes a wagon carrying an enormous black stone, the meteorite of Elagabalus, covered in gold and jewels, and attended by more priests burning incense that makes the air shimmer with strange smoke. And finally, In a chariot that's more mobile temple than transport comes the emperor himself, 14 years old, wearing robes that blur the line between royal and priestly, his face painted with cosmetics that would make a prostitute blush, his eyes rimmed with kohl, his lips stained red, his movements graceful and feminine in a way that makes grown men question everything they thought they knew about masculine authority. This is their new emperor, a painted Syrian boy priest who looks more like a courtesan than a conqueror, who brings foreign gods to the eternal city, who stares at the crowd with eyes that seem to see through the surface of reality into something else entirely. The crowd's reaction is some cheer, because he's young and beautiful, and represents hope after the chaos of civil war. Some mutter darkly about barbarian customs and the decline of Roman values, and some, the smart ones, start making plans to leave the city, because they can sense what's coming, even if they can't yet imagine its full scope. As the imperial procession enters Rome through the Porta Flaminia, heading toward the Palatine Hill and the imperial palace, the boy emperor sees the eternal city spread out before him like a vast playground. The forums, the temples, the palaces, the theatres, all of it is now, all of it waiting to be transformed according to his vision. And his vision, as the Romans are about to discover, is unlike anything the world has ever seen. The first sign that this isn't going to be a normal reign comes during the emperor's first public appearance in the Roman Forum. Traditional protocol demands that he address the people in Latin, wearing a toga, projecting the dignity and gravitas expected of a Roman ruler. Instead, Elagabalus, because that's what he insists on being called now, abandoning his Roman names entirely, appears dressed as the high priest of his Syrian sun god. He's wearing flowing robes of purple silk, jewelry that catches the light like captured fire, and makeup applied with the skill of a professional courtesan. When he speaks, it's in a voice that's deliberately pitched higher than his natural register, almost singing the words in a Syrian accent that makes senators wince. His message is simple. Rome has a new god now, and that god demands new forms of worship. The old Roman deities, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, are being retired. From now on, everyone will worship Elagabalus, the unconquered sun, whose earthly representative just happens to be the emperor himself. The crowd's reaction is stunned silence followed by confused murmuring. This isn't how emperors are supposed to behave. Even the worst of the previous rulers, Caligula, Nero, Domitian, at least pretended to respect Roman traditions. This boy is openly dismissing the entire religious foundation of the empire as if it were an outdated fashion, but he's just getting started. Within weeks of his arrival in Rome, Elagabalus begins the most comprehensive cultural revolution in the empire's history. He builds a massive new temple to Elagabalus on the Palatine Hill, importing Syrian architects to create something that looks more like a Middle Eastern palace than a Roman religious structure. The sacred black stone is installed as the centerpiece, surrounded by altars where sacrifices are made daily, not just animals, but expensive offerings of gold, silver, and precious stones. More shocking still, he orders that sacred objects from other Roman temples be brought to his new shrine: the shield of Mars, the fire of Vesta, the sacred chickens of the augurs, all of it relocated to serve his Syrian god. It's the religious equivalent of looting, and it sends shockwaves through Roman society. But the real scandal isn't what he's doing to Roman religion, it's what he's doing to Roman gender roles, because Elagabalus doesn't just serve his god. He embodies the deity in ways that make Romans question everything they thought they knew about masculinity, femininity, and the nature of imperial power. In the temple ceremonies which he makes increasingly public, Elagabalus dances with an abandon that would be considered inappropriate for a woman, let alone an emperor. He moves his body in ways that suggest things Roman literature doesn't have words for, adopting poses and gestures that seem designed to blur every line between sacred and profane, masculine and feminine, human and divine. The Syrian priests who serve with him are equally scandalous. They're eunuchs mostly, with painted faces and feminine clothing, and they treat the emperor not as a ruler but as a fellow priest performer in some cosmic drama that the Romans can't begin to understand. During religious festivals, which Elagabalus declares with increasing frequency, the whole thing becomes a spectacle that's part religious ceremony, part theatrical performance and part orgy. The nobility tries to maintain dignity by staying away from these performances, but the common people flock to them like moths to flame. There's something hypnotic about watching their emperor abandon every pretense of conventional behavior, something liberating about seeing someone with ultimate power use it to break every rule that's ever been written. Of course, not everyone is entertained. The Senate, those elderly representatives of Roman tradition, watch in horror as their emperor transforms the capital of the world into what they see as a Middle Eastern pleasure palace. They begin holding private meetings, whispering about the good old days when emperors at least pretended to respect Roman customs. But what can they do? He's the emperor. He commands the legions. He controls the treasury. And he's barely 15 years old, with decades of this behavior stretching ahead of them like a very long, very disturbing nightmare. If the Romans thought religious revolution was shocking, they're about to discover that Elagabalus is just getting warmed up. Because having established his god as supreme in Rome, he now turns his attention to establishing himself as supreme in ways that redefine the very concept of imperial authority. Traditional Roman emperors, even the worst ones, maintained certain boundaries. They might be cruel, or mad, or incompetent, but they generally accepted that there were roles they played and expectations they needed to meet. They wore Roman clothes, followed Roman customs, married Roman women, and at least pretended to respect Roman values. Elagabalus throws all of that out the window and then sets the window frame on fire for good measure. First, there's the matter of his appearance. Every public appearance becomes an opportunity to shock, and he approaches fashion like a weapon of mass destruction aimed at Roman sensibilities. He wears silk when Romans expect wool, jewelry when they expect armor, makeup when they expect the weathered dignity of military command. His hair, naturally dark, is often dyed and styled in elaborate arrangements that require teams of Syrian hairdressers. His eyebrows are plucked, his skin is powdered, his lips are painted, and his nails are polished to a shine that can be seen from across a room. When he walks, it's with a deliberately feminine gait that emphasizes the sway of his hips and the grace of his movements. Roman writers, trying to describe this to posterity, struggle with vocabulary. They don't have words for what they're seeing because they've never seen anything like it. The emperor looks like, well, like nothing they've ever imagined an emperor could look like, but appearance is just the beginning. More disturbing to Roman sensibilities is how Elagabalus treats the traditional symbols of imperial power. The purple toga of office becomes a costume in his hands, worn with accessories that transform it from a symbol of dignity into something closer to drag performance. The imperial seal is used to authorize decrees that leave senators speechless with horror. The throne itself becomes a stage prop in elaborate ceremonies that blur the line between statecraft and theater. And then there are the banquets. Roman imperial banquets have always been elaborate affairs, chances for the emperor to display wealth and power while entertaining the elite. But Elagabalus turns these gatherings into something unprecedented in human history: dinner parties from hell. The first shock comes when guests arrive to find that traditional Roman cuisine has been replaced by Syrian delicacies that most Romans can't identify and many can't stomach. Exotic spices burn the tongue, unfamiliar textures revolt the palate, and mysterious sauces leave diners wondering what exactly they're eating. But the food is the least of their problems, because once the meal begins, so does the entertainment, and Elagabalus's idea of entertainment involves testing just how far he can push the boundaries of human dignity before someone breaks. Picture this: you're a Roman senator, a man who's commanded legions and governed provinces, sitting at a banquet hosted by your emperor. The wine is flowing, the conversation is strained, and you're trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while your host, a teenager in makeup and jewelry, regales the room with stories of his religious experiences that sound more like erotic fiction than theology. Then the entertainment begins. Syrian dancers, both male and female, perform routines that would make a brothel keeper blush. The emperor himself joins in, moving his body in ways that suggest he's either divinely inspired or completely insane. And through it all, you're expected to smile, applaud, and pretend that this is normal behavior for the ruler of the civilized world. But that's just the warm-up act, because Elagabalus has discovered that he can use these gatherings to humiliate his guests in ways that satisfy his apparent need to dominate and degrade simultaneously. Senators are forced to participate in games that strip away their dignity layer by layer. Military commanders are made to dress in women's clothing and perform dances. Respected magistrates are ordered to crawl on the floor and bark like dogs while the emperor laughs and claps his hands. And the truly diabolical part, it's all framed as religious ceremony. When someone objects or tries to leave, Elagabalus explains with wide-eyed innocence that they're participating in sacred rituals of his god. To refuse is to commit blasphemy. To resist is to challenge the divine authority of the emperor himself. So they endure it. They smile through their humiliation, participate in their own degradation, and tell themselves that this is temporary, that he's young, that he'll grow out of it. They have no idea that they're witnessing the opening act of a performance that will only get more outrageous as time goes on, because if there's one thing Elagabalus understands, it's that shock value is a finite resource. Each scandal makes the next one less effective. Each boundary crossed makes the next boundary seem less important, so he has to keep escalating, keep pushing, keep finding new ways to horrify and fascinate his audience. And he's about to discover that the most effective way to scandalize the Roman Empire is to attack its most fundamental institution, marriage. Marriage in the Roman Empire isn't just a personal relationship, it's a political institution, a social contract, a way of organizing power and property that's been refined over centuries of civilization. Roman marriages are arranged to strengthen alliances, consolidate wealth, and produce legitimate heirs who will carry on family names and traditions. The emperor's marriage is especially important because it determines the succession, influences policy, and serves as a model for Roman society. Imperial wives are expected to be dignified, modest, fertile, and thoroughly Roman in their values and behavior. Elagabalus looks at this entire system and decides it would be fun to burn it to the ground. His first marriage comes in 2119 AD, when he's still settling into power, and his advisors still harbor hopes that he can be controlled. They arrange a match with Julia Cornelia Pola, a respectable Roman woman from a good family, who they hope will provide a stabilizing influence on the young emperor. The wedding itself should have been a warning of what was to come. Instead of a traditional Roman ceremony, Elagabalus insists on incorporating Syrian rituals that leave the guests confused and uncomfortable. He appears at his own wedding wearing makeup and jewelry that outshine his bride, speaks his vows in a voice pitched higher than normal, and throughout the ceremony seems more interested in the religious aspects than the matrimonial ones. The marriage lasts exactly 1 year, not because Julia Cornelia Pola is unsuitable, but because Elagabalus discovers something that changes his entire approach to relationships: the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins are Rome's most sacred institution, 6 priestesses chosen as children to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years of absolute celibacy. They're forbidden to marry, forbidden to have sexual relationships, forbidden even to be alone with men who aren't relatives. Breaking their vows means death by burial, alive. They represent everything that's pure and untouchable in Roman religion. Naturally, Elagabalus decides he must have one. Her name is Aquilia Severa, and she's everything a Vestal Virgin should be: beautiful, dignified, pure, and absolutely off-limits. She's also, according to Elagabalus, the perfect wife for someone who serves as the earthly representative of a sun god. In his mind, the marriage of a solar deity's priest with a virgin goddess's priestess represents some kind of cosmic union that will produce divine children. In Roman minds, it represents the most blasphemous act imaginable. The announcement of his intention to marry Aquilia Severa sends shockwaves through Roman society. Senators who've been quietly grumbling about the emperor's excesses suddenly find their voices, pointing out that this isn't just unconventional, it's sacrilegious. The Vestal Virgins are untouchable for good reason. To violate their purity is to invite the wrath of the gods and the collapse of the empire. Elagabalus responds to these objections with the kind of logic that only makes sense if you believe you're a living god. He points out that he's not just any man pursuing a Vestal Virgin, he's the high priest of the supreme deity. chosen by the gods themselves to rule Rome. If the gods disapproved of the marriage, would they have given him the power to make it happen? It's the kind of circular reasoning that leaves his critics speechless, partly because it's so audacious, and partly because there's no good answer to it. How do you argue with someone who claims divine authority for everything he does? The wedding of Elagabalus and Aquilia Severa in 220 AD is a spectacle that defies description. It combines Roman imperial ceremony with Syrian religious ritual, traditional marriage customs with innovations that seem designed purely to shock. The emperor appears in full priestly regalia, including makeup and jewelry that make him look more like a bride than a groom. Aquilia Severa, meanwhile, seems to be in a state of shock, whether from religious ecstasy or simple terror. The ceremony itself is conducted in multiple languages: Latin for the Roman guests, Syrian for the religious elements, and Greek for the philosophical passages that Elagabalus insists on including. Throughout it all, he maintains that this union is blessed by the gods and will produce children who are literally divine. The reaction from Roman society is immediate and catastrophic. The Senate formally protests, the people riot in the streets, the Praetorian Guard begins making the kind of ominous comments that historically precede imperial assassinations. Even the army, normally loyal to whoever pays them, starts sending messages that suggest their patience is wearing thin. But Elagabalus, intoxicated by the scale of the scandal he's created, interprets this outrage as proof that he's doing something important. In his mind, the strength of the reaction validates the significance of his actions. If people weren't so upset, it would mean the marriage wasn't cosmically important. So he doubles down, making increasingly outrageous claims about the divine nature of his relationship with Aquilia Severa. He commissions artists to create statues of them as god and goddess. He establishes new festivals celebrating their union. He declares that their future children will be born with supernatural powers and divine authority. The only problem with this plan is that Aquilia Severa, despite Elagabalus's cosmic theories, fails to become pregnant. Whether this is due to her continued commitment to virginity, his own sexual confusion, or simple biological incompatibility, is unclear. What's clear is that after several months of marriage, there are no divine children on the horizon. Elagabalus's solution to this problem is characteristically dramatic. He divorces Aquilia Severa and immediately marries someone else, not because he's given up on the idea of divine offspring, but because he's decided to try a different approach to achieving them. His third wife is Annia Aurelia Faustina, a descendant of Marcus Aurelius and thus connected to one of Rome's most respected imperial dynasties. The marriage is clearly political, designed to shore up his legitimacy by connecting him to beloved former emperors, but legitimacy has never been Elagabalus's primary concern. Within months he's bored with conventional marriage and decides to try something that will make his previous scandals look like minor social faux pas. The second marriage to the Vestal Virgin in 2211 AD sends Roman society into complete meltdown. If the first marriage was shocking, the second is apocalyptic. It suggests that Elagabalus isn't just breaking religious law, he's making a deliberate mockery of it, treating the most sacred institutions of Roman society as toys for his personal amusement. The ceremonies surrounding the second wedding are even more elaborate and disturbing than the first. Elagabalus appears to have decided that if he's going to scandalize Rome, he might as well do it thoroughly. The rituals incorporate elements from Syrian fertility cults, Egyptian mystery religions, and what appear to be his own personal innovations designed purely to horrify his audience. Throughout all of this, there's a growing sense that Elagabalus isn't just eccentric or rebellious. He's engaged in some kind of systematic assault on Roman civilization itself. Every marriage is a weapon aimed at the heart of Roman social order. Every ceremony is designed to break another taboo. Every public appearance challenges another assumption about how emperors should behave. And he's still only 17 years old, with what could be decades of this behavior stretching ahead into the future. But while his marriages are shocking Roman society, they're only one front in Elagabalus's war against conventional behavior, because at the same time he's scandalizing people with his choice of wives, he's also exploring relationships that challenge even more fundamental assumptions about gender, sexuality, and the nature of imperial power. Roman society, for all its military glory and cultural sophistication, has very rigid ideas about sexual roles. Men are expected to be dominant, aggressive, penetrators rather than penetrated. Women are expected to be passive, receptive, devoted to their husbands and families. These roles aren't just social preferences, they're believed to be natural laws, cosmic principles that define the proper order of civilization. Elagabalus looks at these expectations and decides they're guidelines he has no intention of following. His exploration of alternative sexuality begins quietly, with relationships that his advisors hope are just youthful experimentation. He develops close friendships with young men from Syria, relationships that might be acceptable as long as they remain discreet and don't interfere with his imperial duties. But discretion has never been one of Elagabalus's strength, and his relationships quickly become anything but private. The first major scandal involves a young Syrian named Hierocles, a former slave who's been freed and elevated to a position in the imperial household. Hierocles is beautiful in the way that appeals to Elagabalus. Delicate features, graceful movements, an androgynous quality that blurs traditional gender lines. Their relationship begins as friendship and quickly develops into something that horrifies Roman observers. Elagabalus doesn't just favor Hierocles with imperial attention, he treats him as if he's a wife, or perhaps as if Elagabalus himself is a wife. The exact nature of their relationship is hard to determine from the shocked accounts of Roman historians, but it clearly involves role reversals that challenge everything Romans believe about masculine behavior. Hierocles is given honors normally reserved for imperial wives. He's consulted on matters of state. He's presented at court ceremonies with a deference that suggests he holds some kind of official position in the imperial household. Most shocking of all, Elagabalus seems to defer to him in ways that suggest Hierocles is the dominant partner in their relationship. For Romans, this represents the complete inversion of natural order. An emperor is supposed to dominate everyone around him, his wives, his friends, his subjects, his enemies. The idea that he might submit to someone else, especially someone who was formerly a slave, violates every principle of Roman authority. But Elagabalus seems to revel in this violation. He makes his relationship with Hierocles increasingly public, appearing with him at ceremonies where their intimacy is obvious to everyone present. He commissions art that depicts them together in poses that suggest both religious ecstasy and erotic union. He refers to Hierocles using terms normally reserved for imperial spouses, and then, as if this isn't scandalous enough, he does something that pushes the boundaries even further. He begins publicly exploring what we might today recognize as gender identity questions, but which to the Romans look like complete madness. It starts with small things, changes in dress that go beyond his usual flamboyant style, to something more fundamentally feminine, alterations in his voice and mannerisms that suggest he's trying to embody a different gender entirely, references to himself using feminine pronouns and titles that leave his translators stumbling over their words. Roman historians, writing decades later, struggle to describe what they witnessed because they don't have vocabulary for it. They write about Elagabalus seeking doctors who could transform his male anatomy into female, about him offering vast rewards to anyone who could accomplish this transformation, about him adopting the dress and behavior of a woman so completely that visitors to the palace sometimes mistake him for an empress rather than an emperor. Whether these accounts are accurate or exaggerated is impossible to determine from this distance in time. What's clear is that Elagabalus is exploring aspects of identity that Roman society has no framework for understanding. He's not just breaking sexual taboos, he's challenging the fundamental categories that Romans use to organize their understanding of human nature. And he's doing it all in the most public way possible, using the platform of imperial power to force Roman society to confront questions they've never had to consider. The relationship with Hierocles lasts for over a year, scandalizing Roman society and apparently satisfying some need in Elagabalus for emotional and sexual submission that his marriages to women never addressed. But like all of his relationships, it eventually ends in dramatic fashion when he meets someone new who captures his attention. This time, it's a man named Zoticus, an athlete from Smyrna whose physical attributes are apparently so impressive that news of them reaches the emperor in Rome. Elagabalus, never one to let opportunity pass unexplored, arranges for Zoticus to be brought to the capital so he can investigate these reports personally. What follows is a love affair that makes his relationship with Hierocles look restrained. Elagabalus becomes completely obsessed with Zoticus, showering him with gifts that would bankrupt lesser nations and honors that elevate him far above his station. For several months, Zoticus becomes the effective ruler of Rome, with the emperor hanging on his every word and granting his every request. But this relationship, like all the others, is doomed by the same forces that drive Elagabalus toward it: his need for novelty, his appetite for scandal, and his complete inability to maintain interest in any person or situation once it becomes familiar. By 221 AD, after 3 years on the throne, Elagabalus has managed to scandalize Roman society so thoroughly that even people who thought they were prepared for anything are running out of capacity for shock. His religious innovations have undermined traditional Roman spirituality. His marriages have made a mockery of Roman social institutions. His sexual relationships have challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and power. But he's not done yet, because having exhausted the possibilities for scandalizing Rome through religion, marriage, and sex, he's about to discover that there are still frontiers of outrageous behavior left to explore. And the next frontier involves turning the Roman Empire into his personal theater for increasingly elaborate and expensive performances that blur the line between imperial ceremony and complete insanity. By the 3rd year of his reign, Elagabalus has discovered that being emperor offers unlimited opportunities for theatrical expression, and he approaches this discovery with the enthusiasm of a child in a toy store who's just been told he can have anything he wants. Roman emperors have always understood the importance of spectacle, bread and circuses. The saying goes, keep the people fed and entertained, and they'll tolerate almost anything. But previous emperors used spectacle to reinforce their authority, staging games and celebrations that demonstrated their power and generosity while maintaining their dignity. Elagabalus uses spectacle to destroy dignity entirely, creating performances that leave audiences unsure whether they're witnessing religious ceremony, political theater, or elaborate practical jokes at the expense of civilization itself. His innovations begin with the traditional Roman banquet, that institution of imperial hospitality that's supposed to demonstrate the emperor's wealth while providing opportunities for political networking among the elite. Previous emperors used these gatherings to display their sophistication, serving elaborate meals while engaging in cultured conversation about literature, philosophy, and affairs of state. Elagabalus transforms banquets into endurance tests designed to break his guests' will to maintain any pretense of dignity. Picture arriving at an imperial dinner party to find that the dining couches have been replaced with beds covered in rose petals, not a thin scattering for decoration, but literal mountains of flowers so deep that guests sink into them up to their waists. The air is so thick with the perfume of crushed roses that breathing becomes difficult, and more than one senator has been known to faint from the overwhelming fragrance. But that's just the beginning. The menu itself becomes a weapon of psychological warfare. Elagabalus delights in serving foods that challenge every assumption about what constitutes appropriate imperial cuisine. Ostrich brains, peacock tongues, the wombs of pregnant sows, delicacies so exotic and expensive that eating them feels less like dining and more like participating in some kind of ritualistic consumption of the empire's wealth. And then there are the surprise courses, dishes designed not to nourish but to shock. Guests bite into what appears to be bread, only to discover it's made of wax. They reach for wine to find their cups filled with vinegar. They're served elaborate pastries that crumble to reveal live birds, which then fly frantically around the dining room while everyone tries to maintain their composure. The entertainment at these gatherings defies every convention of Roman hospitality. Instead of dignified poetry readings or respectable musical performances, Elagabalus stages shows that would make a brothel keeper blush. Dancers perform routines that simulate sexual acts with such explicitness that married women flee the room in horror. Musicians play melodies from Syrian fertility cults while priests demonstrate religious rituals that involve more nudity than most Romans see in their entire adult lives. And through it all, Elagabalus moves among his guests like a host from another dimension, dressed in costumes that change throughout the evening, speaking in voices that range from seductive whispers to shrill declarations, treating the entire gathering as if it's a religious ceremony in which he's both high priest and living god. But the truly diabolical element of these banquets is the way they trap the attendees in their own social obligations. Roman etiquette demands that guests show appreciation for their host's hospitality, no matter how bizarre that hospitality becomes. To leave early is to insult the emperor. To refuse to participate is to commit a breach of protocol that could have political consequences. Eating foods they can't identify while watching entertainment that challenges their understanding of human decency, all while maintaining the frozen smiles of men who know they're participating in their own humiliation, but can't figure out how to escape it. The banquets become legendary throughout the empire, stories told in whispers by people who aren't sure whether to be horrified or impressed. Some guests claim they've seen things at imperial dinners that violate the laws of nature. Others insist that the emperor possesses supernatural powers that allow him to create experiences beyond normal human comprehension. Still others maintain that the entire imperial court has been possessed by demons from Syria, but the banquets are just one aspect of Elagabalus's theatrical innovations. He also transforms the traditional Roman religious calendar into a series of increasingly outrageous festivals that force the entire city to participate in his vision of divine worship. The Festival of Roses, celebrated in honor of his Syrian sun god, requires every citizen of Rome to wear flowers in their hair and dance in the streets. The sight of dignified Roman magistrates prancing through the forum with roses in their togas becomes so common that visitors from the provinces assume it's a new form of madness that's infected the capital. The Festival of Lights involves covering every building in Rome with oil lamps, creating a glow that can be seen for miles outside the city. The cost is astronomical, requiring the treasury to purchase oil from across the Mediterranean. But Elagabalus insists that his god demands this demonstration of devotion from his worshippers. Most bizarre of all is the Festival of Sacred Marriage, during which Elagabalus reenacts his cosmic union with various deities through ceremonies that blend religious ritual with theatrical performance. These events, staged in public spaces throughout Rome, feature the emperor in elaborate costumes representing different gods and goddesses, acting out mythological scenes with a cast of priests, courtiers, and occasionally unwilling members of the audience. The Romans, watching their emperor dance through the streets dressed as a goddess while Syrian priests play music that sounds like the screaming of exotic birds, begin to wonder if they're witnessing the end of civilization or its transformation into something entirely new. But perhaps the most telling aspect of these performances is how they reveal Elagabalus's relationship with power itself. Traditional emperors use ceremony to reinforce their authority, surrounding themselves with symbols and rituals that emphasize their dominance over others. Elagabalus uses ceremony to explore power, treating imperial authority as a costume he can put on or take off depending on the role he wants to play. During religious festivals, he presents himself as a conduit for divine forces that transcend human authority. At state banquets, he acts as a host whose generosity is so extreme it becomes a form of aggression. In private audiences, he experiments with different personas, sometimes the dignified ruler, sometimes the seductive courtesan, sometimes the religious mystic whose insights come from direct communication with the gods. This fluidity of identity, this refusal to be contained within conventional categories, is perhaps what disturbs Romans more than any specific scandal. They can understand corruption, cruelty, even madness in their emperors, but they can't understand someone who treats imperial power as raw material for artistic expression rather than as a tool for domination. And artistic expression, for Elagabalus, increasingly involves pushing boundaries not just of taste or propriety, but of physical possibility itself. His experiments with luxury become legendary even in an empire accustomed to imperial excess. He bathes in pools filled with wine instead of water, claiming that ordinary bathing is beneath someone who serves as the earthly representative of a sun god. The wine, naturally, must be of the finest vintage, imported at enormous expense from the best vineyards in the empire. He sleeps on beds made entirely of rose petals, changed daily to ensure maximum freshness. The logistics of this simple preference require a network of suppliers stretching across the Mediterranean, shipping flowers to Rome in quantities that strain the empire's transportation systems. His clothing becomes increasingly elaborate and expensive, incorporating materials and designs that challenge every assumption about appropriate imperial dress. Silk from China, dyes from India, jewelry from the edges of the known world, all combined into costumes that cost more than most provinces generate in annual tax revenue. But the most telling aspect of these luxuries is how they serve Elagabalus's apparent need to transform every aspect of existence into a form of performance. He doesn't just want to be comfortable or wealthy. He wants to inhabit a reality so removed from ordinary experience that his very existence becomes a work of art. This artistic approach to imperial life extends to his treatment of government administration, which he approaches with the same creative spirit he brings to religious ceremony and personal relationships. Traditional Roman bureaucracy, with its emphasis on precedent, procedure, and practical efficiency, becomes raw material for experimentation. He appoints officials based not on their qualifications or experience, but on their physical beauty, their entertainment value, or their willingness to participate in his theatrical visions. A former chariot driver becomes a provincial governor because Elagabalus enjoys his conversation. A Syrian dancer is put in charge of grain distribution because her performances in religious ceremonies demonstrate what the emperor considers appropriate devotion to the gods. The Senate, watching qualified administrators replaced by performers and courtesans, begins to understand that they're witnessing not just bad government, but the systematic transformation of the Roman state into something unrecognizable. Laws are written as if they're poetry. Diplomatic correspondence reads like love letters. Military orders incorporate religious imagery from Syrian mystery cults. And through it all, Elagabalus seems genuinely surprised when these innovations fail to produce the results he expects. In his mind, if government is conducted with appropriate reverence for the gods and sufficient attention to aesthetic beauty, it should function more effectively than the boring administrative systems of previous emperors. The fact that provinces begin to revolt, that tax collection becomes chaotic, that military discipline starts to break down, all of this strikes him as evidence that his subjects simply don't understand the divine principles he's trying to implement, rather than proof that his methods might be fundamentally flawed. By 2020 AD, after 4 years of this theatrical approach to imperial rule, the Roman Empire is beginning to show serious strain. The treasury, drained by elaborate festivals and exotic luxuries, struggles to meet basic military expenses. The army, confused by orders that read like religious poetry, loses discipline and effectiveness. Provincial governors, chosen for their entertainment value rather than their administrative skills, fail to maintain order in their territories. More ominously, the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers whose primary job is protecting the emperor, begin to make the kind of ominous comments that historically precede imperial assassination. They've tolerated religious innovations, sexual scandals, and administrative chaos, but they're starting to question whether an emperor who treats the empire as his personal theater is capable of defending Roman interests against external threats. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who orchestrated Elagabalus's rise to power, watches these developments with growing alarm. She's an intelligent woman who understands that political theater is only effective as long as it doesn't interfere with practical governance. The Syrian gold that bought her grandson the throne is running out, and the Roman patience that initially tolerated his eccentricities is wearing thin. More importantly, she's begun to notice changes in Elagabalus himself that suggest his experimental approach to imperial power is starting to consume the person wielding it. The boy who started his reign as a creative rebel against Roman convention is becoming something more disturbing, someone so disconnected from ordinary human experience that he may no longer be capable of rational decision-making. His relationship with reality becomes increasingly tenuous as he spends more time in the elaborate fantasy world he's created around himself. Surrounded by Syrian priests who tell him he's divine, by courtiers who compete to flatter his every whim, by lovers who treat him as a god rather than a human being, he begins to lose touch with the practical consequences of his actions. When provincial governors report rebellions, he responds by commissioning art that depicts him as a victorious deity, rather than by sending troops to suppress the uprisings. When the treasury reports financial difficulties, he organizes new festivals to demonstrate the god's favor, rather than implementing economic reforms. When military commanders express concerns about army discipline, He invites them to participate in religious ceremonies that he believes will solve their problems through divine intervention. Julia Maesa, watching her carefully orchestrated plan for family power slowly collapse into chaos, begins to consider options she'd hoped never to explore. Because she has another grandson, Elagabalus's cousin Alexander Severus, who's been quietly growing up to be everything Elagabalus is not: dignified, conventional, respectful of Roman traditions, and potentially capable of restoring stability to an empire that's beginning to spin out of control. The choice she faces is the kind that defines the darkest moments of imperial history: abandon the grandson she elevated to save the dynasty she created, or watch everything she's built crumble in the ruins of his increasingly detached theatrical experiments. But before she can act on these considerations, Elagabalus makes a decision that transforms what might have been a manageable political crisis into an existential threat to his continued survival. He decides to make Heracles, his former slave and current lover, his co-emperor. The announcement, made during a public ceremony in early 22 AD, sends shockwaves through every level of Roman society. Previous emperors have honored their favorites with wealth, titles, and political positions, but the idea of sharing imperial power with someone who was literally owned as property represents a complete inversion of every principle on which Roman authority is based. Heracles, for his part, seems as surprised as everyone else by this development. He's enjoyed the privileges of imperial favor, but there's no evidence he ever sought or expected to be elevated to imperial rank. The historical sources suggest he actually tried to discourage Elagabalus from this course of action, perhaps understanding better than the emperor himself what kind of reaction it would provoke. But Elagabalus, by this point in his reign, has become incapable of recognizing boundaries between his personal desires and political possibilities. If he loves Heracles, and if he's emperor, then obviously Heracles should be emperor too. The logic is so simple and clear to him that he can't understand why everyone else finds it controversial. The Roman Senate's reaction is immediate and unequivocal. They refuse to recognize Heracles' elevation, not diplomatically, not with the careful political language usually used to oppose imperial decisions, but with flat, open defiance that amounts to a declaration of war against the emperor's authority. For the first time in his reign, Elagabalus faces organized opposition that he can't overcome through charm, bribery, or theatrical distraction. The senators aren't scandalized or confused. They're furious, and they're united in their determination to prevent what they see as the final degradation of Roman imperial dignity. The Praetorian Guard, already nervous about their emperor's stability, begin to make preparations that suggest they're considering more direct forms of opposition. Military commanders in the provinces start sending coded messages to Rome, testing the political winds and positioning themselves for whatever comes next. Most ominously, Julia Maesa stops defending her grandson's actions and begins what can only be described as damage control, reaching out to political allies to assure them that the family remains committed to Roman values and imperial stability. Elagabalus, faced with this unprecedented resistance, makes a series of increasingly desperate attempts to reassert his authority. He threatens senators with exile or execution. He promises new privileges to the Praetorian Guard. He stages even more elaborate religious ceremonies designed to demonstrate his divine authority. But for the first time since becoming emperor, his theatrical performances fail to achieve their intended effect. Instead of awe or shocked submission, they provoke mockery and contempt. Romans who once watched his scandals with horrified fascination now see them as the desperate acts of someone who's lost control of both his empire and himself. The end, when it comes, is swift and brutal in the way that imperial endings usually are. On March 11th, 22 AD, members of the Praetorian Guard enter the imperial palace with a simple mission: remove Elagabalus from power and replace him with his cousin Alexander Severus, who's been quietly waiting in the wings as a more suitable alternative. Elagabalus, apparently sensing that his theatrical approach to imperial power has finally encountered an audience that refuses to be entertained, attempts to flee Rome with Heracles and his mother Julia Soaemius. But there's nowhere in the empire he can run that's beyond the reach of Roman soldiers, and his 4-year reign has created too many enemies for him to find sanctuary anywhere. The guards find him hiding in a latrine in the palace, a location that later historians would claim as symbolically appropriate for someone who had spent his reign treating Roman dignity like excrement. Whether this detail is accurate or represents the kind of editorial commentary that Roman writers love to add to their accounts of fallen emperors is impossible to determine, but it certainly fits the narrative they wanted to tell about his demise. What follows is quick and efficient. Elagabalus is killed, along with his mother and Hierocles. Their bodies are dragged through the streets of Rome, subjected to the kind of posthumous humiliation that the Romans reserved for enemies of the state. Finally, they're thrown into the Tiber River, the traditional fate of criminals whose very existence is deemed a pollution that must be washed away from the eternal city. Alexander Severus, barely 13 years old, is proclaimed emperor by the same Praetorian Guard that had just murdered his cousin. The Senate, desperate to restore some semblance of traditional Roman governance, immediately confirms his elevation and begins the process of erasing Elagabalus from official imperial history. Within days, statues of the dead emperor are torn down and melted for scrap metal. His name is chiseled off monuments and public buildings. The elaborate temple he built for his Syrian sun god is rededicated to traditional Roman deities. His religious innovations are banned, his administrative appointees are dismissed, and his legal reforms are reversed. It's as if the Roman establishment has decided that the best way to deal with the 4-year nightmare of Elagabalus's reign is to pretend it never happened. But erasing someone from official history is easier than erasing them from human memory, and the stories of Elagabalus's reign prove too shocking, too fascinating, and too unprecedented to disappear entirely. Roman historians, writing decades later when it's safe to discuss the scandalous emperor, struggle with how to present his story to posterity. They can't ignore him entirely. His reign is too significant, and its consequences too far-reaching, but they also can't describe his actions without violating their own standards of literary decency. The result is a historical record that reads like a collection of rumors, gossip, and sensationalized accounts designed more to shock readers than to provide accurate information. Writers like Cassius Dio and the authors of the Historia Augusta present Elagabalus as a figure so depraved and unnatural that he serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when divine authority falls into the wrong hands. These accounts, filtered through the moral sensibilities of later generations, probably exaggerate some aspects of his behavior while missing others entirely. The Romans who wrote about him didn't have vocabulary or conceptual frameworks for understanding gender fluidity, religious syncretism, or the kind of performance art that Elagabalus seemed to be creating during his reign. What they did understand was that he had violated every boundary they considered sacred, challenged every assumption they held about proper imperial behavior, and demonstrated that unlimited power in the hands of someone with no respect for conventional limits could produce results that nobody was prepared to handle. But the legacy of Elagabalus extends far beyond the immediate political crisis his reign created, because in his 4 years as emperor, he had done something unprecedented in human history. He had used the ultimate symbol of masculine authority, the Roman imperial purple, to explore questions of identity, sexuality, and gender that wouldn't be openly discussed in Western civilization for another 17 centuries. His experiments with religious syncretism, bringing Eastern mystery cults into contact with traditional Roman practices, prefigured the religious transformations that would eventually produce Christianity as the empire's dominant faith. His theatrical approach to imperial power anticipated the kind of spectacular monarchy that would emerge in later Byzantine and medieval courts. Most significantly, his apparent exploration of gender identity and sexual roles created a historical precedent for questioning the rigid categories that societies use to organize human experience. The Roman historians who wrote about his desire to transform his male anatomy into female anatomy, his adoption of feminine dress and behavior, and his apparent identification with goddesses rather than gods, were documenting something that wouldn't be openly discussed again in Western society until the late 20th century. Whether Elagabalus was consciously challenging gender roles or simply expressing personal preferences in a cultural context that had no framework for understanding them is impossible to determine from the surviving sources. What's clear is that his reign demonstrated the revolutionary potential that emerges when someone with unlimited power decides to use that power to explore the boundaries of human identity, rather than to dominate others. The fact that this exploration ended in assassination and historical erasure says more about the limits of Roman tolerance than about the validity of the questions he was asking, because underneath all the scandals, all the religious innovations, all the sexual experimentation, and all the theatrical excess, Elagabalus was grappling with fundamental questions that every human society eventually has to address. What does it mean to be a man or a woman? How do we balance individual expression with social order? What happens when traditional authorities are challenged by new forms of experience? The Romans decided they weren't ready for these questions, so they killed the person who was asking them and tried to pretend the questions had never been raised. But questions, like the people who ask them, have a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression. In the centuries that followed his death, the name Elagabalus became synonymous with imperial excess and moral degradation. Medieval chroniclers used him as an example of what happened when divine authority was corrupted by human vice. Renaissance writers cited his reign as proof that absolute power inevitably led to absolute corruption. But in recent decades, as Western society has begun to grapple more openly with questions of gender identity and sexual expression, some historians have started to reassess the traditional narrative of Elagabalus as simply a depraved tyrant. They've begun to see him instead as someone who was wrestling with aspects of human experience that his society had no vocabulary for understanding, using the only tools available to him, imperial power and religious authority, to explore questions that wouldn't be openly discussed for another 2 millennia. This reinterpretation doesn't excuse the genuine political failures of his reign or the chaos his experiments created within the Roman Empire, but it does suggest that his historical significance extends beyond serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, because Elagabalus represents something unique in the historical record. A moment when someone with unlimited authority chose to use that authority not to dominate others but to explore the boundaries of their own identity. The fact that this exploration was conducted through methods that shocked and horrified his contemporaries doesn't diminish its significance. It emphasizes how revolutionary his approach actually was. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Elagabalus isn't the scandals he created or the boundaries he crossed, but the questions he raised about the nature of power itself. Traditional rulers use authority to impose their will on others. Elagabalus used authority to discover who he was and what he might become if freed from conventional expectations. It was an experiment that lasted only 4 years and ended in assassination and historical condemnation, but it created a precedent for using power as a tool for self-exploration rather than domination, for treating authority as raw material for artistic expression rather than as a weapon for controlling others. Whether this precedent represents a tragic waste of imperial opportunity or a glimpse of possibilities that wouldn't be fully explored for another 2,000 years, depends on your perspective on the relationship between individual expression and social order. What's undeniable is that in those 4 chaotic years between 218 and 222 AD, a teenage Syrian priest showed the world what happened when someone with unlimited power decided to use it to become fully themselves, rather than to make others submit to their will. The results were scandalous, shocking, and ultimately unsustainable within the political and cultural context of the Roman Empire, but they were also unprecedented in human history, and wouldn't be matched for revolutionary audacity until the modern era finally developed the vocabulary and conceptual frameworks necessary to understand what Elagabalus had actually been attempting during his brief, bizarre, and utterly unforgettable reign as the most obscene emperor in history. And somewhere in the chaos of those 4 years, buried beneath the religious scandals and sexual experiments and theatrical excess, lies a lesson that every generation has to learn anew, that the most dangerous thing you can do with unlimited power isn't to abuse it for personal gain or use it to dominate others, but to use it to ask questions that your society isn't ready to answer, because questions, unlike emperors, are very difficult to assassinate. And the questions that Elagabalus raised during his reign about identity, sexuality, gender, power, and the nature of human possibility are still with us today. still challenging our assumptions, still forcing us to confront the boundaries we've built around acceptable behavior. In that sense, perhaps Elagabalus achieved a form of immortality that eluded every other Roman emperor. He became not just a historical figure, but a symbol of the eternal human struggle between individual expression and social order, between the desire to explore new possibilities and the need to maintain stability. The Romans killed him and tried to erase his memory, but they couldn't kill the questions he embodied or erase the example he set. And as long as human beings continue to wrestle with questions of identity and authority, the ghost of the obscene emperor will continue to haunt our collective consciousness, reminding us that sometimes the most important revolutions begin not with armies or manifestos, but with a single individual who refuses to accept the limitations that society places on human possibility. That refusal, more than any specific scandal or innovation, is what made Elagabalus truly dangerous to the Roman Empire and truly significant to history, because in the end, the most subversive thing anyone can do isn't to break laws or violate customs. It's to demonstrate that the categories we use to organize human experience are arbitrary constructs rather than natural laws, and that with sufficient courage and power, they can be rewritten entirely. Elagabalus rewrote those categories for 4 brief years, and then the world killed him for it. But the rewriting had been accomplished, the precedent had been set, and the questions had been asked. And questions, as every tyrant eventually discovers, are far more dangerous than armies, and much harder to defeat than any human enemy. But let's step back from the grand historical analysis for a moment, and look at the daily reality of what it was actually like to live in Rome during those 4 years when the empire was ruled by someone who treated civilization itself as a performance art project. Because while historians can debate the deeper significance of Elagabalus's reign, the people who actually had to live through it experienced something far more immediate and visceral: the slow-motion collapse of everything they thought they understood about how the world worked. Imagine you're a Roman citizen in 2020 AD, 2 years into this experiment in imperial insanity. You wake up in your modest home near the Forum, and the first thing you notice is the sound drifting through your window. Not the usual morning bustle of commerce and conversation, but the wailing of Syrian pipes and the chanting of foreign priests conducting dawn rituals in a language that makes your skin crawl. You dress in your cleanest toga and head out to conduct the day's business, perhaps a visit to the courts or the market, and you discover that the streets have been transformed overnight. Rose petals carpet the Via Appia so thickly that your sandals sink into them with each step. The air is heavy with incense that makes you dizzy, and perfumes so strong they seem to coat your throat. And everywhere you look there are decorations for yet another festival, honoring gods you can't pronounce in ceremonies you don't understand. The Forum, that ancient heart of Roman civic life where your ancestors debated the great questions of law and governance, has been turned into something that looks more like a Middle Eastern bazaar than the center of imperial administration. Syrian merchants hawk exotic spices and mysterious elixirs. Priests with painted faces and feminine clothing conduct rituals that involve more nudity than most Romans see in a lifetime. And through it all moves a parade of imperial courtiers dressed in costumes that blur every line between male and female, sacred and profane, Roman and foreign. You try to conduct your business, perhaps settling a contract dispute or arranging a marriage for your daughter, but the traditional mechanisms of Roman law have been. The magistrate you need to see is busy participating in a religious ceremony that seems to involve him crawling on his hands and knees while Syrian priests sprinkle him with flower petals. The judge whose ruling you're waiting for has been appointed not for his legal expertise but because the emperor enjoys his singing voice and finds his dancing entertaining. Your daughter, meanwhile, comes home with stories from her friends about the new fashions at court, where young women are experimenting with Syrian makeup techniques and clothing styles that would have been considered scandalous just a few years ago. She asks why she can't paint her eyes with kohl like the emperor's courtiers, why she has to wear boring Roman stolas when the imperial household dresses in silk and jewelry that catches the light like captured fire. And you realize, with growing horror, that the corruption isn't just political, it's cultural. The emperor isn't just breaking laws and violating customs, he's modeling a completely different way of being human, and your own children are beginning to find that model more attractive than the traditional Roman virtues you've tried to instill in them. At dinner that evening, your family gathers around the simple Roman meal that's been standard for generations. Bread, olive oil, wine, perhaps some cheese or preserved meat, but the conversation is dominated by gossip about the latest imperial scandal. Stories so outrageous that you're not sure whether to believe them or dismiss them as the kind of rumors that always swirl around controversial figures. Your neighbor claims he saw the emperor dancing through the streets dressed as the goddess Venus, complete with feminine clothing and makeup that would make a prostitute blush. Your brother insists he heard from a reliable source that Heracles has been given authority over military appointments and is choosing officers based on their physical attractiveness rather than their combat experience. Your wife whispers stories shared by other women about the emperor's marriages, relationships so bizarre and sacrilegious that even discussing them feels like participating in blasphemy. And underneath all the gossip and scandal, there's a growing sense of unease that goes deeper than mere disapproval of imperial behavior, because what Elagabalus is doing isn't just shocking, it's revealing uncomfortable truths about the nature of Roman authority that most citizens would prefer not to confront. For centuries, Romans have believed that their empire's success comes from their superior virtues: discipline, courage, respect for tradition, clear hierarchies that put everyone in their proper place. They've conquered the world not through mere military might but through moral superiority, the gods' favor earned by their adherence to principles that lesser peoples lack the strength to follow. But now their emperor, the living embodiment of Roman authority, is demonstrating that those principles are optional. He's showing that someone with sufficient power can ignore every rule, violate every custom, and challenge every assumption, and the empire continues to function. Not well perhaps, but it functions. This revelation is deeply disturbing to people who've organized their entire lives around the belief that Roman success depends on Roman virtue. If the emperor can behave like a Syrian courtesan and still command legions, collect taxes, and maintain order, then what does that say about the importance of the virtues they've been taught to revere? Some Romans respond to this crisis by doubling down on traditional values, becoming even more rigid in their adherence to ancestral customs, as if moral purity could somehow counteract the corruption emanating from the imperial palace. They dress more conservatively, speak more formally, worship more devoutly, as if their personal virtue can compensate for their emperor's vice. Others go in the opposite direction, interpreting Elagabalus's example as permission to explore their own boundaries. If the emperor can experiment with gender roles, why shouldn't ordinary citizens? If imperial authority can be used for personal expression rather than domination, why shouldn't everyone express themselves more freely? The result is a cultural war that plays out in every aspect of Roman life. Families split along generational lines, with older members clinging to traditional values, while younger ones embrace innovations inspired by the imperial court. Marriages founder when spouses find themselves on opposite sides of questions about appropriate behavior that never had to be asked before Elagabalus made them unavoidable. Religious practice becomes a battleground, as traditional Romans insist on worshipping the old gods in the old ways, while others are attracted to the Syrian mysteries that promise more immediate and intense spiritual experiences. The streets fill with competing processions, conservative Romans marching in dignified silence to honor Jupiter and Mars, while Syrian converts dance and sing their way to ceremonies that incorporate elements from mystery cults across the eastern Mediterranean. Trade and commerce suffer, as merchants struggle to navigate a legal system that changes based on the emperor's whims rather than established precedent. Contracts written under one set of assumptions become invalid when Elagabalus decides that his god demands different standards for commercial transactions. Foreign traders arriving in Rome with goods to sell find themselves dealing with officials whose appointment qualifications include dancing ability and willingness to participate in religious ceremonies that violate the merchant's own cultural taboos. The military, that backbone of Roman power, begins to show cracks as traditional discipline conflicts with imperial innovations. Soldiers who've been trained to value strength, courage, and masculine virtue find themselves serving an emperor who embodies none of these qualities and seems actively hostile to them. Officers chosen for their combat experience are replaced by courtiers selected for their entertainment value, creating a command structure that prioritizes aesthetic considerations over tactical competence. Provincial governors, meanwhile, struggle to maintain order in territories that are increasingly confused about what Roman authority actually represents. When local rebellions break out, as they inevitably do in any empire, the governors find themselves unable to respond effectively because the legions are led by officers who know more about Syrian dance than military strategy. Tax collection becomes chaotic as the emperor's expensive tastes drain the treasury faster than traditional revenue sources can replenish it. New taxes are imposed not based on economic analysis, but on Elagabalus's religious visions, which apparently inform him that his god demands specific tributes that can only be obtained through increasingly creative forms of imperial fundraising. And through it all, the emperor himself seems blissfully unaware of the chaos his innovations are creating, surrounded by courtiers who compete to flatter his every whim and priests who assure him that his actions are divinely inspired. He inhabits a bubble of affirmation that insulates him from the practical consequences of his theatrical experiments. When reports reach him of provincial unrest, he interprets them as evidence that his religious message hasn't yet spread to the furthest corners of the empire, rather than as signs that his policies are creating genuine problems. When the treasury reports financial difficulties, he sees it as a test of faith that will be resolved through more elaborate ceremonies, rather than as a mathematical problem requiring practical solutions. This disconnect between imperial perception and imperial reality becomes increasingly dangerous as Elagabalus's reign progresses, because while he's busy exploring questions of identity and authority through performance art, actual enemies of Rome are taking note of the empire's apparent weakness and making plans to exploit it. Barbarian tribes along the northern frontiers, who've been held in check by Roman military superiority for generations, begin to probe imperial defenses and discover that the legions are less disciplined and effective than they used to be. Persian forces in the east launch exploratory raids to test Roman response times and find that provincial governors are more concerned with implementing religious reforms than with maintaining border security. Pirates in the Mediterranean, emboldened by reports of imperial chaos, become more aggressive in their attacks on Roman shipping, knowing that naval commanders appointed for their looks rather than their seamanship are unlikely to mount effective responses. Within the empire itself, local strongmen begin to question whether imperial authority is worth respecting when it's wielded by someone who seems more interested in religious ceremony than in governance. Regional rebellions, once unthinkable in the face of Roman military might, begin to seem like viable options when the alternative is submission to an emperor who treats his subjects like actors in an elaborate theatrical performance. Julia Maesa, watching these developments from her position within the imperial household, begins to understand that her grandson's reign isn't just politically unsustainable, it's actively dangerous to the survival of the empire she helped him inherit. The Syrian gold that bought his throne is running out. The Roman patience that initially tolerated his eccentricities has been exhausted, and the military force that ultimately maintains imperial power is beginning to question its loyalty to a commander who treats warfare as just another form of artistic expression. But perhaps most ominously, she begins to notice changes in Elagabalus himself that suggest his experimental approach to imperial power is consuming not just his political authority, but his connection to reality itself. The boy who started his reign as a creative rebel against Roman convention is becoming something more disturbing. Someone so immersed in his own theatrical creation that he can no longer distinguish between performance and reality, between divine inspiration and personal delusion. His religious experiences, once clearly calculated to shock and challenge his audience, now seem genuinely involuntary. He speaks of conversations with his God that apparently occur during private moments when there's no audience to impress. He makes decisions based on dreams and visions that he describes with the conviction of someone who believes they're receiving direct divine revelation, rather than experiencing the psychological effects of isolation and unlimited power. His relationships with other people become increasingly parasitic as he surrounds himself only with individuals who reinforce his delusions and eliminate anyone who might challenge his perceptions. Court positions go exclusively to people who excel at telling him what he wants to hear, creating an echo chamber that amplifies his detachment from external reality. Most tellingly, his theatrical performances lose their element of conscious artistry and become something closer to compulsive behavior. Where once he seemed to be making deliberate choices about how to present himself and his authority, now he appears driven by internal forces that he can't control or even fully understand. Julia Maesa, who survived decades of imperial politics by being able to read people and situations with ruthless accuracy, recognizes the symptoms of someone who's been broken by the very power she helped him achieve. The grandson she elevated to save her family's position has become a liability not just to the empire, but to himself, trapped in a performance that's consuming his humanity while isolating him from everyone who might be able to help him. And she understands. with the cold clarity that comes from a lifetime of political calculation, that the time for managing Elagabalus has passed. The choice now is between saving him and saving the empire, and for someone whose entire life has been devoted to the pursuit and maintenance of power, that's not really a choice at all. The preparations she begins making in early 2020 AD are the kind that experienced political operators undertake when they need to eliminate a problem that can't be solved through conventional means. Quiet conversations with key military commanders, discreet meetings with influential senators, careful soundings of public opinion to determine how much support exists for more drastic solutions. Most importantly, she begins positioning Alexander Severus, her other grandson, as an alternative to Elagabalus that combines family legitimacy with the traditional Roman virtues that his cousin so spectacularly lacks. Where Elagabalus is theatrical, Alexander is dignified. Where Elagabalus is innovative, Alexander is conservative. Where Elagabalus challenges Roman assumptions, Alexander embodies them. The contrast is deliberate and carefully cultivated, designed to provide Romans with a clear choice between the chaos they're experiencing and the stability they remember from earlier reigns. Julia Maesa, who once bet everything on Elagabalus's ability to shock his way to power, now bets everything on Alexander's ability to restore order through the simple expedient of being boringly competent. But before she can implement these plans, Elagabalus makes the decision that seals his fate, the elevation of Hierocles to co-emperor, that transforms what might have been a manageable succession crisis into an existential threat to the dynasty she spent her life building. Because while Romans might tolerate an eccentric emperor, even a scandalous one, they will not tolerate the complete inversion of social order that Hierocles represents. A former slave ruling as emperor doesn't just violate Roman law, it challenges the fundamental assumption that some people are born to command while others are born to obey. The announcement of Hierocles' elevation provokes reactions that go beyond political opposition to something approaching religious horror. Romans who've watched Elagabalus's other innovations with resigned disapproval now speak of divine punishment, of the gods' wrath, of the need to purge the pollution that's contaminating the empire's sacred authority. Julia Maesa, reading the political winds with the expertise of someone who's navigated imperial courts across multiple reigns, understands that the situation has moved beyond her ability to manage through conventional political tools. The choice is no longer between different approaches to governing the empire. It's between preserving the imperial system itself and watching it collapse under the weight of innovations that have pushed Roman tolerance past its breaking point. The plans she finalizes in the weeks following Hierocles' elevation are the kind that leave no room for mercy or second chances, because at this point, saving Elagabalus would require destroying everything else she's worked to build, and Julia Maesa has never allowed personal affection to override political necessity. On March 11th, 22 AD, when the Praetorian Guard enters the imperial palace to remove Elagabalus from power, they're not acting as independent agents motivated by their own moral outrage. They're implementing a carefully orchestrated plan designed by the same woman who once orchestrated his rise to power, executed with the same ruthless efficiency that brought him to the throne 4 years earlier. The speed and completeness of his fall demonstrates just how isolated Elagabalus had become during his reign. There are no loyal supporters rushing to his defense, no provincial armies marching to restore him, no popular uprisings demanding his return. The boy who once commanded the allegiance of Syrian legions and the enthusiasm of Roman crowds dies with no one to mourn him except the handful of courtiers and lovers who shared his fate. His mother Julia Soaemias dies alongside him, not because she participated in his scandals but because she enabled them by failing to provide the guidance that might have saved him from his own worst impulses. Hierocles dies because he represents everything Romans find threatening about the social revolution that Elagabalus's reign seemed to promise. Their bodies, dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber, become symbols of Roman society's rejection, not just of their individual actions but of the entire experiment in alternative authority that they represented. The crowds that cheer their destruction aren't just celebrating the removal of a bad emperor, they're affirming their commitment to traditional values and conventional expectations about how power should be wielded. Alexander Severus, proclaimed emperor by the same guards who killed his cousin, represents the restoration of everything that Elagabalus challenged. Where Elagabalus was innovative, Alexander is traditional. Where Elagabalus was theatrical, Alexander is dignified. Where Elagabalus questioned boundaries, Alexander respects them. His first acts as emperor systematically reverse every major innovation of his predecessor's reign, like a meticulous restorer working to remove graffiti from a classical statue. The Syrian temple is rededicated to Roman gods. The religious festivals are replaced with traditional ceremonies. The administrative appointees chosen for their entertainment value are dismissed in favor of competent bureaucrats. Most symbolically, the elaborate theatrical costumes and exotic cosmetics that defined Elagabalus's public image are replaced with the simple toga and clean-shaven dignity that Romans associate with proper imperial behavior. Alexander Severus looks like what an emperor is supposed to look like, acts the way an emperor is supposed to act, and governs according to principles that Romans recognize and approve. The contrast is so complete and so deliberate that it feels like waking up from a 4-year nightmare to discover that normal life is still possible. Romans who had begun to wonder whether their empire was transforming into something unrecognizable suddenly find themselves living in a world that makes sense again, where emperors behave like emperors and the traditional virtues are respected rather than mocked. But the very completeness of this restoration reveals something important about what Elagabalus had actually accomplished during his brief reign, because the ease with which his innovations are reversed suggests that they were never really integrated into Roman society in the first place. They were always external impositions maintained by imperial force rather than accepted changes embraced by the population. In other words, Elagabalus's revolution was always more theatrical than real, more performance than transformation. He demonstrated that someone with sufficient power could violate any taboo and challenge any assumption, but he never proved that such violations could create lasting change in the absence of popular support. This realization helps explain why his memory was so easily erased from official imperial history. Unlike other controversial emperors whose reigns left permanent marks on Roman law, culture, or institutions, Elagabalus's innovations died with him because they existed only as extensions of his personal will rather than as responses to genuine social needs. Caligula's megalomania, Nero's artistic pretensions, and Domitian's paranoia all reflected broader tensions within Roman society that persisted long after their deaths. But Elagabalus's gender experimentation, religious syncretism, and sexual unconventionality were so far outside Roman experience that they couldn't take root in imperial soil. Yet this doesn't diminish the historical significance of what he attempted, even if it suggests limitations on what he achieved, because in those 4 years between 218 and 222 AD, he provided a preview of possibilities that wouldn't be seriously explored again in Western civilization for another 17 centuries. His willingness to use imperial power for self-exploration rather than domination, his challenge to rigid gender categories, his synthesis of different religious traditions, and his treatment of authority as raw material for artistic expression, all prefigured developments that would eventually become central to modern discussions of identity, spirituality, and power. The fact that his contemporaries weren't ready for these explorations, that they responded with assassination and historical erasure, says more about the limits of Roman tolerance than about the validity of the questions he was raising, because questions, unlike the people who ask them, have a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression, and in the end, perhaps that's the most important legacy of Elagabalus's reign, not the specific innovations he attempted, most of which were reversed within days of his death, but the precedent he established for using power to explore human possibility, rather than to constrain it. Every subsequent ruler who has chosen self-expression over domination, who has challenged conventional gender roles, who has synthesized different spiritual traditions, or who has treated authority as a tool for artistic creation rather than political control, has walked in footsteps first laid down by a Syrian teenager who spent 4 years showing the world what it might look like if the ultimate symbol of masculine authority could be used to explore questions that masculine authority traditionally forbids. The Romans killed him for asking those questions, but they couldn't kill the questions themselves. And as long as human beings continue to wonder about the boundaries of identity, the nature of power, and the possibilities for self-transformation, the ghost of the most obscene emperor in history will continue to haunt our collective imagination. reminding us that sometimes the most important revolutions begin not with armies or manifestos, but with a single individual's refusal to accept the limitations that society places on human possibility. But let's dig deeper into what made Elagabalus's approach to these questions so uniquely dangerous, because it wasn't just what he was exploring, it was how he went about exploring it. Other figures throughout history have challenged gender norms, questioned religious orthodoxy, or experimented with unconventional sexuality. What made Elagabalus different was that he had unlimited power to turn his personal explorations into imperial policy, forcing an entire civilization to participate in his journey of self-discovery, whether they wanted to or not. Consider the psychological dynamics at work here. Most people who question conventional boundaries do so from positions of relative powerlessness. They experiment in private. They form small communities of like-minded individuals. They express themselves through art or literature or other forms of cultural production that allow society to engage with their ideas gradually, at its own pace. When he decided to explore feminine identity, he didn't do it in the privacy of his chambers. He did it in front of the entire Roman Senate. When he wanted to experiment with religious syncretism, he didn't join a mystery cult. He transformed the state religion of the most powerful empire in the world. When he felt attracted to men, he didn't conduct discreet affairs. He elevated his lovers to positions of imperial authority. This approach created a kind of forced intimacy between the emperor and his subjects that violated every principle of Roman political psychology. Traditional imperial authority depends on distance, on the emperor being sufficiently removed from ordinary experience that his subjects can project their fantasies and expectations onto him, without being confronted with inconvenient realities about his actual personality. But Elagabalus shattered that distance completely. Romans didn't just have to obey him, they had to know him in all his psychological complexity and sexual ambiguity and spiritual confusion. They couldn't maintain comfortable illusions about imperial dignity because he insisted on displaying every aspect of his inner life in the most public possible forums. This forced intimacy was perhaps more disturbing to Roman sensibilities than any particular scandal. Romans could understand and even tolerate imperial vice as long as it was conducted with appropriate discretion. They dealt with emperors who were cruel, mad, or incompetent. But they'd never dealt with an emperor who was so relentlessly, aggressively authentic, who refused to maintain any boundary between his public role and his private identity. The result was a kind of psychological assault on the entire concept of imperial authority, because if the emperor could be so transparently human, so obviously driven by the same desires and confusions that affect ordinary people, then what made him special? What justified his absolute power over others? What separated him from any other teenager working through identity issues with the added complication of unlimited resources and no adult supervision? These questions struck at the heart of Roman imperial ideology, which depended on the fiction that emperors were fundamentally different from ordinary mortals, chosen by the gods, blessed with supernatural wisdom, elevated above normal human limitations by their divine mandate to rule. Elagabalus's radical authenticity exposed this fiction as exactly that, a useful lie that made absolute power psychologically tolerable for both rulers and subjects. And once that lie was exposed, it became very difficult to believe in again. Even after Alexander Severus restored traditional imperial dignity, even after Elagabalus was erased from official history, the precedent had been set. Future Romans would always know, somewhere in the back of their minds, that imperial authority was something that could be performed rather than embodied, something that existed only as long as people agreed to believe in it. This knowledge would prove remarkably durable. Throughout the remaining centuries of the Roman Empire, there would be periodic eruptions of the kind of radical experimentation that Elagabalus pioneered. Emperors who challenged gender norms, who embraced foreign religions, who used imperial power for personal expression rather than political domination. None of them would go as far as Elagabalus in their challenges to conventional authority, and none would last as long as his 4 years, but they would all be following a template he established, proving that his reign wasn't just an isolated aberration, but the opening move in a long game of challenges to traditional power structures that would play out over centuries. More immediately, His reign had profound effects on the people who lived through it, effects that couldn't be erased as easily as his name from imperial monuments, because while his innovations died with him, the psychological impact of witnessing them survived in the minds of everyone who experienced those 4 years of imperial revolution. Consider the Roman matron who watched her teenage daughter experiment with Syrian cosmetics and clothing styles inspired by the imperial court. Even after Alexander Severus restored traditional values, even after those cosmetics were banned and those clothes went out of fashion, that mother would always remember that there had been a time when different possibilities existed, when the boundaries she'd been taught to respect had proved malleable. Or think about the Roman soldier who served under officers appointed by Elagabalus for their physical beauty rather than their military competence. Even after those officers were replaced with traditional commanders, that soldier would always know that military authority was, at least partially, a matter of performance and perception rather than inherent capability. Or consider the senator who was forced to participate in Elagabalus's theatrical banquets, who had to crawl on his hands and knees while the emperor laughed and Syrian priests chanted in unknown languages. Even after dignity was restored to senatorial proceedings, that senator would carry the memory of his humiliation, and with it the knowledge that senatorial authority was only as strong as the emperor's willingness to respect it. These psychological scars, or perhaps we should call them psychological openings, created a kind of underground awareness that would influence Roman society long after Elagabalus himself was forgotten. People who had witnessed the complete breakdown of traditional categories would always know, on some level, that those categories were choices rather than natural laws, conventions rather than cosmic principles. This underground awareness would surface in unexpected ways throughout the later empire. In the gradual acceptance of Christianity, with its challenges to traditional Roman religious practice, in the increasing prominence of women in imperial politics, in the growing influence of Eastern cultural practices on traditional Roman customs, in the eventual transformation of the Roman Empire into something that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations. None of these developments can be directly attributed to Elagabalus's influence, but all of them became possible partly because he had demonstrated that Roman society was more flexible than it appeared, more capable of radical change than anyone had previously imagined. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of his reign was on the institution of imperial power itself, because by using that power for personal exploration rather than political domination, he had revealed possibilities that would never be completely forgotten. Future emperors would occasionally remember that imperial authority could be used for purposes other than maintaining order and expanding territory. It could be used to explore questions of identity, to challenge social conventions, to create new forms of human experience. Most in them would choose not to pursue these possibilities, but the knowledge that they existed would always be there, like a door that had been opened and could never be completely closed again. This knowledge would prove particularly significant during the later crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire faced existential challenges that couldn't be addressed through traditional means, as conventional approaches to imperial authority proved inadequate to deal with barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and social upheaval. Some emperors would turn to the kind of radical innovations that Elagabalus had pioneered. They would experiment with new religious syntheses, trying to create spiritual foundations for imperial authority that could transcend ethnic and cultural boundaries. They would challenge traditional gender roles, recognizing that survival might require mobilizing human resources that conventional categories left untapped. They would use imperial power for theatrical purposes, understanding that maintaining morale might be more important than maintaining dignity. None of these later emperors would go as far as Elagabalus in their innovations, and none would be as successful in forcing Roman society to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of authority and identity. But they would all be walking paths that he had first explored, using techniques that he had developed, pursuing possibilities that his reign had made thinkable. And as the Roman Empire gradually transformed into the Byzantine Empire, and as European civilization slowly evolved into forms that would have been unrecognizable to classical Romans, the influence of those 4 years between 218 and 222 AD would continue to ripple through history in ways both subtle and profound. Because Elagabalus had done something unprecedented in the annals of absolute power, he had used unlimited authority not to impose his will on others, but to discover who he might become if freed from conventional limitations. The experiment had ended in assassination and historical erasure, but the precedent had been established, the questions had been asked, and the possibilities had been demonstrated. And possibilities, once demonstrated, are very difficult to forget completely. This brings us to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Elagabalus's historical legacy, the way his story has been reinterpreted and re-understood by each generation that encounters it. Because while his contemporaries saw him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power in the wrong hands, later generations have found different meanings in his brief, chaotic reign. Medieval chroniclers, writing in societies where imperial authority was closely tied to religious orthodoxy, focused on his religious innovations as evidence of what happened when rulers abandoned proper Christian governance. They saw his Syrian sun worship and gender experimentation as symptoms of the spiritual corruption that had led to Rome's eventual fall, proof that empires which abandoned traditional values inevitably collapsed. Renaissance writers, living through their own period of cultural transformation and religious upheaval, were more interested in his artistic and theatrical innovations. They saw him as a precursor to the kind of spectacular monarchy that was emerging in their own time, a ruler who understood that power could be performed as well as exercised. Enlightenment historians, with their emphasis on reason and natural law, typically dismissed him as an example of the irrationality that absolute monarchy inevitably produced. They used his reign to argue for the superiority of limited government and rational administration over the arbitrary rule of individual will. But it's the modern era that has found the most complex and sympathetic interpretations of his story, partly because we've developed vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that allow us to understand aspects of his behavior that previous generations could only describe as madness or vice. Contemporary discussions of gender identity and sexual orientation have provided new ways to interpret his apparent exploration of feminine roles and his relationships with men. Where earlier historians saw evidence of moral corruption or psychological disorder, modern scholars see someone grappling with questions of identity that his society had no framework for understanding. Modern understanding of religious syncretism and spiritual experimentation has offered new perspectives on his efforts to blend Syrian and Roman religious traditions. Where medieval chroniclers saw blasphemy and Renaissance writers saw political calculation, contemporary historians see someone trying to create new forms of spiritual meaning that could transcend cultural boundaries. And modern theories about performance and identity have provided fresh ways to understand his theatrical approach to imperial authority. Where Enlightenment thinkers saw evidence of arbitrary rule, contemporary scholars see someone experimenting with the performative aspects of power in ways that prefigured postmodern discussions about the constructed nature of authority. None of these modern interpretations excuse the genuine political chaos that his reign created, or minimize the suffering caused by his failure to address practical problems of imperial governance, but they do suggest that his historical significance extends beyond serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. Because in those 4 years between 218 and 222 AD, Elagabalus was wrestling with questions that every human society eventually has to confront. How do we balance individual expression with social order? What happens when traditional categories of identity prove inadequate to contain human experience? How do we create forms of authority that allow for change while maintaining stability? These questions don't have easy answers, and Elagabalus certainly didn't find satisfactory solutions to them. But by asking them so publicly and so dramatically, by using the ultimate symbol of traditional authority to explore the boundaries of human possibility, he created a precedent that would influence discussions of power and identity for centuries to come. And that precedent becomes particularly relevant in our own historical moment, when many of the same questions that Elagabalus raised through his reign are being asked again through different means and in different contexts. Contemporary debates about gender identity and sexual orientation echo the challenges he posed to Roman assumptions about masculine and feminine roles. Modern discussions about religious pluralism and spiritual synthesis reflect his efforts to create new forms of meaning that transcend traditional boundaries. Current conversations about the performative aspects of political authority revisit his experiments with theatrical governance. The difference is that we're asking these questions in democratic societies with constitutional protections for individual rights and established mechanisms for peaceful change. We don't need emperors to force social transformation because we have other means of exploring new possibilities and implementing necessary reforms, but the questions themselves remain remarkably similar, and Elagabalus's approach to them, however flawed and ultimately unsuccessful, continues to offer insights into both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in using power to challenge conventional boundaries. His reign reminds us that radical change is always possible, that no social convention is so entrenched that it can't be challenged, that human identity is far more flexible than most societies are comfortable acknowledging. But it also demonstrates the importance of building consensus for change rather than imposing it through force, of working within existing institutions rather than trying to destroy them entirely, of balancing individual expression with collective needs. Most importantly, his story illustrates the complex relationship between personal authenticity and public responsibility that everyone in positions of authority must navigate. Because while there's something admirable about his refusal to be constrained by conventional expectations, there's also something troubling about his apparent inability to consider how his personal explorations affected the millions of people whose lives depended on stable imperial governance. This tension between individual authenticity and collective responsibility is particularly relevant in our own time, when social media and celebrity culture often blur the boundaries between personal expression and public influence. Like Elagabalus, contemporary figures with large platforms face questions about how much of their authentic selves they should reveal to their audiences, how their personal journeys of self-discovery affect the people who follow them, and whether the pursuit of individual truth justifies the disruption of established social patterns. The answers to these questions aren't simple, and they certainly weren't simple for a 14-year-old who found himself with unlimited power over the most powerful empire in the world. But by asking them so dramatically and paying such a high price for his approach to answering them, Elagabalus provided future generations with a case study in both the possibilities and the perils of using authority for self-exploration rather than social domination. And that case study remains relevant today, not because we should emulate his specific choices, most of which were disastrous, but because we should understand the underlying dynamics he was navigating, the relationship between power and identity, between individual authenticity and collective responsibility, between personal transformation and social stability. These dynamics don't disappear just because we live in democratic rather than imperial societies. They simply manifest in different forms, through different institutions, with different consequences, but the fundamental questions remain the same. How do we balance the need for personal growth with the obligation to serve others? How do we use whatever authority we have, whether imperial, corporate, artistic, or simply the influence that comes from being heard, to create positive change without causing unnecessary harm? Elagabalus never found satisfactory answers to these questions, and his failure cost him his life and his historical reputation. But by asking them so publicly and so dramatically, he provided a cautionary tale that continues to offer valuable lessons about the complexities of power, identity, and social change. In the end, perhaps that's the most important legacy of his brief, scandalous reign, not the specific innovations he attempted, most of which died with him, but the example he provided of someone using ultimate authority to explore ultimate questions about human nature and human possibility. The fact that his exploration ended in disaster doesn't invalidate the questions he was asking or diminish the courage required to ask them in such a public forum. It simply reminds us that some kinds of exploration are too dangerous to undertake without careful preparation, broad support, and deep consideration of the consequences for others. And it suggests that the most important revolutions might not be the ones imposed by powerful individuals on unwilling societies, but the ones that emerge gradually from the collective recognition that old answers no longer work and new questions need to be asked. Elagabalus forced his questions on the Roman Empire through imperial decree and paid for it with his life. But the questions themselves survived his death and continue to shape human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle, reminding us that sometimes the most lasting changes begin not with answers, but with someone brave enough or reckless enough to ask whether there might be better ways to organize human experience than the ones we've inherited from the past. And perhaps that's the final irony of his story, that someone who seemed so concerned with immediate gratification, with shocking his contemporaries and satisfying his own desires, ended up creating something far more durable than any of his more conventional predecessors. The emperors who came before and after him built monuments that crumbled, won victories that were forgotten, established dynasties that collapsed. But Elagabalus, in his brief 4 years of chaos and scandal, planted seeds of change that are still growing 2,000 years later. Those seeds took root, not in marble or bronze, but in the human imagination, in the collective memory of a species that witnessed one of its own use ultimate power not to dominate others, but to explore the boundaries of what it might mean to be human. And while the immediate results of that exploration were disastrous, the long-term implications continue to unfold in ways that even he couldn't have anticipated, because every time someone challenges conventional gender roles, they're walking in footsteps first laid down by a Syrian teenager who refused to be confined by Roman expectations of masculine behavior. Every time someone experiments with religious syncretism, they're following a path blazed by an emperor who tried to merge Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. Every time someone uses a position of authority to explore questions of identity, rather than to reinforce existing hierarchies, they're drawing on precedents established in those 4 extraordinary years when the Roman Empire became a stage for the most radical performance in human history. The performance ended badly, as radical performances often do, but it established possibilities that would never be completely forgotten, demonstrated alternatives that would always be available to future generations willing to risk everything to explore them. And in a world that often seems trapped by its own conventions, paralyzed by its own traditions, Elagabalus stands as a reminder that change is always possible, that boundaries exist to be tested, and that sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is refuse to accept the limitations that others try to place on our becoming, even if that refusal costs us everything we have, even if it leads to our destruction, even if it results in our names being erased from history and our memories being condemned by posterity. Because some questions are worth asking regardless of the price, some boundaries are worth crossing regardless of the consequences, and some possibilities are worth exploring even if we don't live to see their full realization. That, in the end, may be the most obscene thing about Elagabalus, not his sexual behavior, or his religious innovations, or his theatrical excesses, but his absolute commitment to becoming fully himself regardless of what anyone else thought about it. In a world that demands conformity, that rewards compliance, that punishes authenticity, his willingness to use ultimate power for ultimate self-expression remains the most radical act imaginable, and perhaps that's why his story continues to fascinate us, continues to disturb us, continues to challenge our assumptions about power and identity, and the relationship between individual desires and collective needs, because deep down, we all wonder what we might become if we had the courage or the recklessness to ignore the voices telling us who we're supposed to be, and instead embrace the mystery of who we might actually become. Elagabalus answered that question in the most dramatic way possible, and paid the ultimate price for his answer. But the question itself remains open, waiting for each of us to find our own ways of exploring it, our own means of pushing against the boundaries that constrain human possibility, our own methods of using whatever power we have to discover what it might mean to be fully, authentically, unapologetically ourselves. The Syrian sun god, whose priest he claimed to be, promised eternal light to those who served faithfully. Elagabalus served that god for 4 years with a devotion that scandalized an empire and cost him his life. But in those 4 years, he lit a flame that has never been completely extinguished, a fire that continues to burn in the hearts of everyone who has ever wondered whether there might be more to human existence than the narrow categories into which society tries to force us. That flame flickers in every act of authentic self-expression, in every challenge to conventional authority, in every refusal to accept that things must remain as they have always been. It burns brightest in those moments when individuals choose to become themselves rather than who others expect them to be, when they risk everything for the chance to discover what they might become, if freed from the limitations imposed by fear, tradition, and the desperate human need for approval. And as long as that flame continues to burn, as long as human beings continue to choose authenticity over safety, growth over stagnation, becoming over being, the ghost of the most obscene emperor in history will continue to dance through our collective imagination, reminding us that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the world is the courage to become fully ourselves, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the consequences, regardless of what history might say about our choices, because in the end, history belongs to those who dare to live it, rather than simply endure it, to those who use whatever power they have to push against the boundaries of human possibility, rather than to maintain the status quo. And while Elagabalus may have pushed too hard, too fast, in directions that his world wasn't ready to follow, his willingness to push at all established a precedent that continues to inspire everyone who has ever felt trapped by conventional expectations and dreamed of something more. That's his true legacy, not the scandals or the innovations or the theatrical excesses, but the simple revolutionary idea that power can be used for becoming rather than dominating, for exploring rather than controlling, for discovering rather than conquering. It's an idea that got him killed, but it's also an idea that refuses to die, continuing to resurface in every generation, in every society, in every individual who looks at the world as it is, and dares to imagine what it might become. And perhaps that's obscene enough for any emperor to live and die in such a way that your very existence becomes a question that can never be fully answered, a challenge that can never be completely resolved, a possibility that can never be entirely forgotten, to burn so brightly, even briefly, that the light continues to illuminate pathways that others might follow, roads that others might travel, destinations that others might reach long after you yourself have been consumed by the fire of your own becoming.